Hey, it's Mark here, and welcome to the next edition of the Employee Survival Guide, where I tell you, as always, what your employer does definitely not want you to know about, and a lot more.
Welcome to another episode of the Employee Survival Guide, produced by employment attorney Mark Carey.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want you to picture this scenario for a moment. You've got this high-level banking executive, right?
Okay.
A guy making a very, very substantial salary, standing in a polished corporate boardroom. He looks across the table at his subordinate, who is, another vice president.
Right, so we're talking upper management here.
Exactly. And they are having this completely standard disagreement about the cost of a routine third-party audit. But then the senior executive literally starts clucking like a chicken.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He's making animal noises to coerce the subordinate into a personal gambling bet. It sounds absurd, right?
That sounds completely fake, like a bad sitcom.
Right. It sounds like a scene from a terrible workplace comedy, but it is actually the real-world catalyst for one of the most chaotic federal employment lawsuits to hit the appellate courts recently.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, it shatters that illusion we tend to have about the executive level of multi-billion-dollar financial institutions.
Yeah, we always assume it's so put together.
We do. We assume it's all sanitized professionalism, careful risk calculations, polite HR memos. But you strip away the frosted glass of that conference room, and you're often left with just raw, messy human behavior.
Bullying, basically.
Exactly. Power dynamics, bullying, completely irrational decision-making.
And we're taking you, the listener, right into the center of that mess today. We're looking at a recent decision from the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, a case called Pannek v. U.S. Bank.
Right.
We're going to examine the actual mechanics of corporate internal investigations, what happens when a massive restructuring collides with a harassment complaint, and how the federal appellate courts untangle the timeline to decide whether a major retaliation claim should be decided by a jury. Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we even begin?
Well, the best place to start is really by setting the baseline reality for the people involved. We need to understand who these players are before the corporate drama escalated into a federal lawsuit.
Because, we're not talking about entry-level employees arguing over the break room schedule.
Not at all. We are dealing with high-level executives whose entire careers are built on assessing and mitigating corporate risk.
Okay, let's bring in our main cast then. First, we have Thomas Stratman. In January 2017, U.S. Bank hires Stratman as its vice president of governance control for the Consumer Banking Default Management Group.
That's a mouthful.
Right. To put that in plain English, he's the executive tasked with overseeing the bank's risk control programs within that specific division.
Yeah, he's the guy making sure the bank operates safely, legally, and within the lines of federal compliance.
Exactly. It's a role that requires intense meticulousness.
Oh, absolutely. When you're a VP of governance control, your job is essentially to look for trouble before it happens. Your auditing processes, your stress testing systems, you are basically the internal police for the division's operations.
So Stratman gets settled into this super high-stress role, and about 6 months later, around July 2017, he recruits a former colleague to join him in the bank.
And this is Mark Pannek.
Right. Pannek comes on board as the vice president of third-party risk for consumer lending services, reporting directly to Stratman. And Panek's job is incredibly critical in the modern financial sector. He is responsible for vendor risk.
Which is just a massive liability vector for any bank.
Right. Whenever you read in the news that a major financial institution suffered a massive data breach or got hit with a staggering compliance fine, it's very often because a third-party vendor, like a software provider or a payment processor, had a vulnerability.
Yep.
Panek's entire professional existence revolves around verifying that U.S. Bank's business partners have the proper controls in place, so the bank doesn't end up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal.
And, what's fascinating here is the profound irony of their positions within the company.
Oh, yeah.
You have two vice presidents whose sole mandate is to identify, manage, and neutralize risk. They are the compliance experts. Yet the greatest, most destructive risk they end up facing isn't like a sophisticated syndicate of data hackers.
Right. It's not some external threat.
No, the ultimate risk to their careers comes from their own internal management structure.
It's the classic horror movie trope, right? The call is coming from inside the house.
Exactly.
So Stratman and Pannek are doing their jobs mitigating risk. But in the fall of 2017, U.S. Bank initiates a corporate reorganization. The consumer lending division gets restructured. And as a result of this first reorg, Pannek and Stratman are moved under a new supervisor.
Right.
They now report to a man named John Jemrick, the Senior Vice President of Quality Control.
And this transition marks the point where that baseline of executive professionalism completely begins to disintegrate.
It goes downhill fast.
It really does.
Yeah.
According to the lawsuit, almost as soon as they fall under Jemrick's supervision around November 2017, a pattern of highly inappropriate behavior starts.
And inappropriate feels like way too small a word here. Jemrick allegedly starts sharing explicitly detailed stories about his personal sex life and his dating life with Pannek and Stratman.
Right, and this isn't happening at a bar after hours.
No, this is a senior VP bringing completely unprompted, highly graphic sexual commentary into the daily workflow with his direct subordinates.
You really have to look at the psychological mechanics of that specific dynamic.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Well, when a manager, the individual who literally dictates your compensation, who writes your performance reviews, who controls your upward mobility, decides to obliterate a professional boundary like that, it places the subordinate in a paralyzing bind.
Because what are your options, really?
Exactly. The options are universally bad. If you forcefully tell your senior VP to stop talking about his sex life, do you alienate him and ruin your career trajectory?
Right.
But if you nervously laugh or just nod along to get through the conversation, are you inadvertently signaling that you welcome this behavior?
Yeah.
It completely weaponizes the corporate hierarchy.
And it doesn't stop with the uncomfortable overshares. It morphs into this surreal overt bullying, which brings us to the bedding incident we mentioned at the very top of the show.
Oh, yes. The clucking.
Yeah. So this happens in February 2018. They are in a team meeting. Jemrick and Pannek get into a standard business disagreement regarding how much a specific third-party audit is going to cost the bank.
A completely routine, mundane forecasting discussion.
Right. But Jemrick doesn't just pull rank and say, hey, we're going with my estimate. Instead, he demands a personal financial wager.
Like out of his own pocket.
Yes. He tells Pannek to put his money where his mouth is. Pannek, understandably, tries to diffuse the situation. He pushes back, trying to keep it professional. But Jemrick refuses to let it go. He starts belittling Pannek in front of the entire team and then resorts to literally clucking like a chicken to mock him.
From a behavioral standpoint, this is a textbook demonstration of coercive executive power. We have to understand that Jemrick doesn't care about winning a few bucks.
Right. It's not about the money.
No, it's an extraction of submission. He's using the profound social embarrassment of making animal noises in a professional setting to prove that he can force a subordinate vice president to do something against his will.
And against bank policy.
Exactly.
And sadly, it works. Pannek, fearing the career repercussions of standing up to this absurd display of dominance, he caves. He agrees to the bet. And the kicker here is that Jemrick actually ends up being right about the audit costs.
Of course he is.
Yeah. So Pannek loses the wager and has to physically hand over a $150 gift card to his extremely well-compensated boss.
It serves as a tangible token of submission.
Which raises an important question for you, the listener. Like, put yourself in Panek's shoes. Your boss is acting like a cartoon villain. Why on earth wouldn't a vice president of risk management immediately march down to the human resources department and report that he's being extorted by a clucking senior executive?
That's a great question.
Why the delay? What are you afraid of?
Well, it's one of the most common and frankly legally perilous issues in employment law, the paralyzing nature of corporate power structures. Even at the VP level, reporting a superior is culturally viewed as stepping onto a third rail.
It's career suicide.
Right. There's an overwhelming fear of retaliation. Employees worry they'll be labeled as troublemakers or that the institution will just instinctively close ranks to protect the higher-ranking, higher revenue-generating executive.
Which happens a lot.
It does. Pannek and Stratman clearly weighed the perceived danger of speaking up against the cost of just keeping their heads down and buying a gift card. And, well, it chose silence.
A silence that is going to severely complicate their legal standing later on, but for the moment, they are enduring it. Which brings us to the catalyst for the actual legal explosion. We move from the abuse itself to the corporate reaction, which is driven by yet another shift in the company's structure.
Right around early 2018, U.S. Bank undergoes a second major reorganization.
And another one.
Yeah, the lending and mortgage divisions are merged to create this massive new entity called the CBSS Servicing Group.
Which means new leadership. A new executive enters the narrative, Brian Bolton. Bolton is a senior vice president and the chief administrative officer. So now Pannek, Stratman, and their problematic boss, Jemrick, are all layered underneath Bolton.
Yep, the whole trio.
And Bolton immediately initiates what he calls a synergy exercise.
Which is perhaps the most loaded term in the corporate lexicon.
Oh, absolutely. I hear the word synergy, and my immediate thought is layoffs. What does a synergy exercise actually entail operationally when a bank merges two massive divisions?
Operationally, Bolton is conducting a comprehensive workflow audit. He's holding meetings with his new direct reports to analyze how their teams function, looking for best practices. But primarily, he is hunting for duplication of functions.
Finding the redundancies.
Exactly. When you merge two divisions, you often end up with two people doing the exact same job. The synergy exercise is the process of identifying those redundancies so the company can trim the excess.
Right. It's the polite term for figuring out who is expendable. And the tension is very real for Pannek and Stratman because during this exercise, Bolton is already openly contemplating taking several of Pannek's direct reports and transferring them to another employee, a woman named Allison Roberts.
Right. The ground is literally shifting beneath their feet. Their empire is being dismantled.
The environment is incredibly unstable. And right in the middle of this high anxiety period, in March 2018, U.S. Bank holds a mandatory company-wide training session on appropriate workplace conduct.
We've all sat through these.
Oh yeah, the standard HR module. It reiterates that employees must maintain an atmosphere free of discrimination, intimidation, and harassment. It explicitly bans sexual harassment. Crucially, it outlines the reporting mechanisms, like the anonymous ethics hotline.
And it guarantees protection, right?
Right. It guarantees that U.S. Bank has a zero-tolerance policy for retaliation against anyone who reports misconduct in good faith.
For Pannek, this training session acts as an ignition source. He has been carrying the weight of Jimrick's abuse, the sexual comments, the betting incident for months. Now, the structural stability of his job is threatened by Bolton's synergy exercise. He sits through this HR training promising protection, and he finally decides to utilize the system.
On March 27, Pannek picks up the phone and calls the U.S. Bank ethics hotline. He files a formal complaint against Jimrick.
Okay, here we go.
The report focuses very heavily on the betting incident, the clucking, the extortion of the gift card, and he uses a very specific phrase. He claims Jimrick has created a hostile work environment.
What's fascinating here is the intersection of events. If we look at the timeline, it's critical. On one track, you have Bolton actively conducting a massive structural audit, actively looking for redundancies, and moving operational pieces around the board.
Right.
On the parallel track, you have Pannek, an executive currently under Bolton's microscope, suddenly dropping a major ethics complaint against his immediate supervisor.
I have to play devil's advocate here, because if I'm a corporate defense attorney, I'm looking at this timeline and raising an eyebrow. Are we looking at a brave whistleblower who finally found his courage after being empowered by an HR training? Or is he someone who saw the writing on the wall, realized his job was in jeopardy, and threw a Hail Mary ethics complaint to create an insurance policy?
That is the exact tension at the heart of nearly every complex retaliation lawsuit.
It comes out a lot, her.
Constantly. Courts are constantly wrestling with this dual nature of HR complaints. Is the complaint a legitimate shield to protect a victim from genuine abuse? Or is it a sword wielded by a vulnerable employee to legally paralyze management during a standard layoff?
Because it's incredibly hard to fire someone the week after they report their boss for harassment without it looking like retaliation.
Precisely. And the way a company's management reacts to that specific tension behind closed doors is what dictates whether the company survives the lawsuit or gets demolished by it.
Well, let's follow that paper trail because we have a documented look at exactly how U.S. Bank's management reacted. Pannek makes his hotline call on March 27. 2 days later, on March 29, an HR business partner named Diane Watson reaches out to Brian Bolton, the guy conducting the synergy exercise, and informs him about Pannek's complaint against Jimrick.
So the boss's boss is now fully aware that a whistle has been blown within his newly formed division.
And Bolton's reaction is, well, it's a masterclass in what not to put in writing. On April 2, just a few days after learning about the complaint, Bolton sends an email back to Diane Watson in HR. The subject line is HR-related concerns.
Oh, boy.
If you're a plaintiff's attorney, this email is the holy grail.
It is stunningly candid. In this email, Bolton discusses both Pannek and Stratman. He notes to HR that the two men are very close and that they appear to be worried about their jobs in this new organization.
Which is probably true.
Sure. He complains that they've been reluctant to share operational information with him during his synergy exercise.
And then he just writes his internal monologue out loud. Bolton explicitly states in this corporate email that he questions the timing of Pannek's ethics complaint.
He actually put that in an email.
He outright documents his suspicion that Pannek only filed the grievance out of fear for his future at the bank. He even predicts that Stropman will likely take a similar tack and file his own complaint to protect himself.
But he doesn't stop at merely documenting his suspicions. He concludes the April 2 email by announcing a definitive plan of action. He tells HR that he intends to terminate both Pannek and Stropman in the near future.
Wow.
And he attempts to insulate this decision by stating that his leadership concerns regarding the two men are valid and mutually exclusive of any complaints filed or potentially filed.
I love that phrase, mutually exclusive. He's trying to cast a legal protection spell in real time. He's saying, look, I know they just complained, but I promise my desire to fire them is existing in a totally separate universe from that complaint.
Right, like saying it makes it true.
But here is where the story shifts from a manager just writing a legally dangerous email to a manager actively dismantling the bank's own internal defense mechanisms. Bolton bypasses the PGA.
The peer group analysis. This is a vital mechanical component of the case.
For those of us who haven't worked in the HR department of a massive financial institution, how does a PGA actually work? What is its function?
Well, in a corporation the size of U.S. Bank, you cannot just lay people off based on gut feelings, because gut feelings are highly susceptible to unconscious bias, or in this case, potential retaliation.
Right.
So the bank implements a strict internal policy. A peer group analysis must be completed whenever there are two or more employees in a specific job profile that's being considered for reduction, but you aren't firing everyone in that profile.
You have to choose who stays and who goes.
Exactly. The PGA is a highly structured, objective evaluation tool. Managers must rank the employees against a matrix of consistent criteria, historical performance metrics, specific skills, institutional knowledge. It strips the subjectivity out of the process.
It makes it mathematical.
Yes, it mathematically proves that you terminated employee A instead of employee B because employee B had a higher objective skill score, not because employee A is a minority or older or just filed a harassment complaint.
It's the ultimate corporate shield. It's the document the bank brings to court to say, look, the layoff was fair.
But the protective power of a PGA relies entirely on the integrity of the process. U.S. Bank's strict policy dictates that a PGA must be completed at the very beginning of the reduction in force process.
The beginning.
It must be done before any final termination decisions are made, and it's designed to be a collaborative effort, usually heavily moderated by human resources to ensure fairness.
And Bolton completely inverted that process. In that April 2 email, he makes a unilateral decision that he is going to fire Pannek and Stropman. Only after making that decision does he circle back later in April to fill out the PGA forms.
Yep.
And he does it in a vacuum, without the standard collaborative HR oversight. He made the execution decision first, and then retroactively filled out the objective evaluation forms to justify the conclusion he had already reached.
From an employment law perspective, an employer failing to adhere to its own self-imposed internal procedures is a massive red flag. When a corporation designs a rigorous policy specifically to prevent bias, and a senior manager entirely subverts that policy mere days after an employee engages in protected whistleblowing,
That looks bad.
the courts pay intense attention to that. It signals to a judge, and potentially a jury, that the stated reason for the firing the layoff might merely be a pretext.
And there is a profound, almost poetic irony to this detail. U.S. Bank treats the integrity of the PGA process so seriously that roughly a year after this entire debacle, they end up firing the original bad boss, Jemrick, the clucking guy.
Oh, that's right.
And one of the primary reasons they fired him was because he failed to properly execute a PGA during a different layoff. So the bank will terminate an executive for botching a PGA, yet they defend Bolton when he botches a PGA to fire the guys who reported the harassment.
It brilliantly highlights the inconsistent application of corporate policy, which is the exact fertile ground where retaliation claims are built. But, it's important to recognize that while Bolton is operating in this questionable manner, a completely different arm of U.S. Bank is functioning exactly as it should.
Right. HR is actually doing its job.
The Human Resources Department is simultaneously running a very legitimate, very thorough investigation into Pannek's original complaint against Jemrick.
Right. They assign an HR business partner named Lori Gray to investigate the hotline call. She doesn't sweep it under the rug. She conducts rigorous interviews. On April 16th, she formally interviews Pannek. On April 17th, she interviews Stropman. She speaks with Jemrick, and she pulls in several other employees who were present at these meetings.
And it is during these mid-April investigative interviews with Lori Gray that the actual scope of Jemrick's behavior finally comes to light. During his interview, Pannek finally discloses the inappropriate sexual commentary that Jemrick had been forcing on them for months.
But even in the safety of an HR interview, Pannek struggles to articulate it. He tells Gray that Jemrick was making sexual comments, but when she presses him for the actual details of what was said, Pannek deflects. He broadly refers to the Access Hollywood tapes and mentions that Jemrick used the P word. He is clearly still deeply uncomfortable putting the graphic specifics on the official record.
Which, psychologically, is entirely standard in corporate investigation.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Victims of severe verbal harassment often experience deep embarrassment or trauma regarding the specific language used against them. Repeating those explicit details to a corporate investigator, knowing it will be typed into a formal document, is highly distressing.
That makes total sense.
We see this exact same reluctance with Stroutman. When Lori Gray interviews him, Stroutman confirms that yes, Jemrick regularly made highly explicit sexual comments during their team meetings. But when she asks him to elaborate, Stroutman flatly refuses to repeat what was said because he finds the language too disturbing.
Despite the reluctance to quote the harassment directly, Lori Gray successfully does her job. She completes the investigation and substantiates the complaint. She formally concludes that John Jemrick violated U.S. Bank's workplace respect policy.
And the bank takes definitive action. They don't just give Jemrick a verbal warning, they issue a formal written reprimand. They officially discipline him for demonstrating poor executive judgment regarding the betting incident, for accepting the gift card, and for discussing his personal dating and sex life.
And they enforce tangible consequences, too. Jemrick is hit with a 90-day ban on any promotions or salary increases, and his substantial annual bonus is placed at risk. According to Bolton's later deposition testimony, this discipline was actually effective. Jemrick ceased the sexual commentary entirely after the HR intervention.
So on paper, the system worked beautifully. The victim spoke up, the company investigated, the harasser was found guilty, severe punishment was dispensed, and the toxic behavior was eradicated. A textbook victory for corporate HR.
Except for what happens on May 15th, 2018.
Right. Just weeks after this successful HR investigation wraps up, Brian Bolton executes the plan he outlined in his April 2 email. He officially terminates the employment of both Pannek and Stroutman.
Unbelievable.
The bank transfers the majority of Panek's vendor risk duties to Allison Roberts and scatters his remaining responsibilities among various other employees outside of his original group.
So we have to reconcile these two realities. The bank successfully disciplined the harasser, but the victims who rang the alarm bell were still escorted out of the building. How does the law untangle that? Can a massive corporation point to their successful HR investigation and say, hey, we handled the harassment perfectly, therefore we are innocent, while the guys who complained are standing in the parking lot unemployed?
This brings us to the core mechanism of Title VII retaliation claims. The law recognizes that the underlying harassment and the subsequent reaction to the reporting of that harassment are two entirely distinct legal events.
Okay.
An employer can handle the initial harassment complaint with absolute perfection. But if they subsequently terminate the complainant because they engaged in the protected act of complaining, they've committed a separate, distinct violation of unlawful retaliation.
So it's two separate crimes, basically.
Exactly. And this distinction is why the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals had to step in, reverse the lower court's decision, and rule that Pannek and Stroutman's retaliation claim must be decided by a jury.
To really grasp how the appellate court arrived at that decision, we need to talk about the mechanics of how these lawsuits are fought. The court relies on a legal concept known as the McDonnell Douglas burden-shifting framework. Now, I know burden-shifting framework sounds terribly dry.
It's very lawyerly.
But I want to understand how it actually functions in a courtroom when both sides are claiming the other is lying.
It's arguably one of the most important functional mechanisms in employment law. The Supreme Court created this framework in the 1970s because they recognized a fundamental reality. Employees almost never possess direct evidence of illegal discrimination or retaliation.
Right. A boss is never going to send an email saying, I am firing you specifically because you filed an HR complaint.
Exactly. The evidence is almost entirely circumstantial. So McDonnell Douglas creates a structured process. Think of it as a highly formalized three-step ping-pong match to evaluate that circumstantial evidence.
Okay, let's play the match. Step 1.
Step 1 requires the employee to serve the first ball. They carry the initial burden to establish what's called a prima facie case of retaliation.
Prima facie, what does that mean?
It just means at first glance, or on the face of it, the employee doesn't have to prove the whole case yet. They just have to show a baseline connection. They must demonstrate 4 things. First, they engaged in an activity protected by law, like filing a complaint. Second, the employer was aware of that activity. Third, the employee suffered a materially adverse action, such as termination. And fourth, there's a causal connection between the protected activity and the adverse action.
It sounds like a relatively low bar. It's just establishing that the timeline looks suspicious enough to warrant a closer look.
Exactly.
And in this case, the court ruled that Pannek and Stratman easily cleared that low bar. The causal connection was visually apparent because Bolton drafted his email outlining his plan to fire them in early April, mere days after he was informed of the March 27 ethics complaint. The proximity and time alone is enough to look suspicious at first glance. So, ping. The ball is served over the net to U.S. Bank.
Now we move to step 2. The burden of production shifts entirely to the employer. U.S. Bank has to return the serve by articulating a legitimate, completely non-retaliatory reason for terminating the employees.
And what did they say?
Well, U.S. Bank executes this step flawlessly. They look at the court and say, "We did not fire them in retaliation for the hotline call. We fired them because the bank was undergoing a massive, pre-planned corporate reorganization. We were merging 2 massive divisions, conducting a synergy exercise, and executing a standard reduction in workforce to eliminate redundant positions."
Pong.
Pong. The ball goes back to the employees for the final volley.
And this final step is where the entire case is won or lost. The burden shifts back to the employees, and they now have to prove that the bank's highly polished, seemingly neutral reason, the corporate synergy exercise, is actually a pretext. But what exactly does proving pretext require? How do you prove what a corporation was secretly thinking?
Proving pretext is incredibly difficult. You essentially have to prove that the employer is lying. The employees must present evidence that would allow a reasonable person to conclude that the stated reason the reorganization was either factually false, was not the actual motivating factor, or was insufficient to justify the termination.
You have to poke holes in their story.
They have to poke holes in the employer's story until the whole thing deflates. And this is where the Sixth Circuit majority found the critical evidence. They looked at the circumstances surrounding Bolton's actions and identified 3 massive structural cracks in the bank's defense.
Let's walk through those cracks, because this is where Bolton's behavior really unravels. Crack number 1 is the timing, specifically that April 2 email.
The court placed immense weight on that document. Bolton didn't just make a vague decision to fire them at some indeterminate point in the future. He documented his overt skepticism regarding their complaint and announced his intention to terminate them just days after learning they had contacted the ethics hotline. When an executive explicitly links their knowledge of a complaint with a termination plan in the same breath, that immediate documented proximity is very strong circumstantial evidence of pretext.
Crack number 2 is even more devastating because it involves a contradiction from higher up the food chain. Bolton's entire defense rested on the premise that he was merely executing a necessary reduction in workforce as part of this grand synergy exercise. But the court examined the sworn deposition of Bolton's direct supervisor, an executive vice president named David Little.
This part is crazy.
Right. David Little testified that he had, and I'm quoting him here, no expectations that anyone would be terminated during this specific reorganization.
That testimony completely hollows out Bolton's narrative. If the senior architect of the restructuring didn't foresee the need for any layoffs, why is Bolton suddenly initiating layoffs targeting the exact 2 executives who just filed an ethics complaint?
It makes no sense.
To compound that contradiction, the court noted that at the time of the terminations, Bolton actually had open, unfilled positions on his team for risk and controls and risk strategy.
Pannek and Stratman were literally risk management executives. Their exact skill set was needed.
Yet Bolton testified he couldn't recall even considering placing them in those open roles. He simply opted for termination.
He just wanted them removed from the board entirely. And the third crack in U.S. Bank's defense brings us right back to the mechanical failure of the PGA process.
The court noted that Bolton jumped the gun. As we discussed, he made the definitive decision to fire them on April 2, and then retroactively completed the objective evaluation forms on his own, entirely bypassing the mandatory HR collaboration. The court was careful to state that an employer's failure to follow its own internal procedures isn't always enough on its own to prove pretext. But when you combine that procedural failure with the suspicious timing of the email and the glaring contradiction from the executive vice president, It paints a very compelling picture. It provides more than enough circumstantial evidence for a jury to reasonably infer that the synergy exercise was just a smokescreen.
But hold on, because U.S. Bank didn't just passively accept this, they mounted a fierce counterattack based on witness testimony. They produced a current bank employee named Lydia Buster, and Lydia Buster testified under oath that Mark Pannek explicitly confessed to her that his ethics complaint was nothing more than an insurance policy to save his job.
A huge bombshell.
According to her, Pannek bragged that he was intentionally using the harassment complaint as a shield because he sensed the restructuring was going to eliminate his position. If a witness confirms exactly what Bolton suspected, doesn't that validate the bank's decision? Doesn't that prove the bank is innocent of retaliation?
It's a spectacularly powerful piece of evidence for the defense. It perfectly encapsulates the employer's deepest fear regarding malicious HR complaints. However, how the court handles Lydia Buster's testimony provides a crucial lesson in the architecture of the American judicial system. Specifically, the strict division of labor between a judge and a jury.
Because we need to clarify for the listener, this case was at the summary judgment phase. For someone who isn't a lawyer, what does summary judgment actually mean in this context?
Summary judgment is a procedural mechanism where one side, usually the defendant, in this case U.S. Bank, asks the judge to throw the entire case out before it ever reaches a jury. The bank is essentially arguing, Judge, the evidence is so overwhelmingly in our favor that no reasonable jury could possibly rule against us, so let's skip the trial and end this right now.
Just end it.
But crucially, at the summary judgment phase, a judge is strictly forbidden from weighing the credibility of witnesses or deciding who is telling the truth. The judge's only job is to determine if there is a legitimate, factual dispute that requires a trial to resolve.
And there is a massive factual dispute here, because Pannek completely denied the conversation. He testified under oath that he never, at any point, spoke to Lydia Buster about his ethics complaint being an insurance policy.
Precisely. You have two individuals under oath presenting diametrically opposed realities. Lydia Buster claims Pannek confessed to manipulating the system. Pannek claims Buster is fabricating the conversation.
So who decides?
If the federal judge steps in at this phase and says, well, Lydia Buster seems more believable to me, therefore U.S. Bank wins, that judge has unconstitutionally usurped the role of the jury. Assessing credibility, looking at a witness on the stand, analyzing their demeanor, and deciding who is lying and who is telling the truth, that is the exclusive sacred domain of a jury of your peers.
Right.
The Sixth Circuit majority examined this conflict and ruled correctly. We have competing evidence. A jury might believe Buster and clear the bank, or a jury might believe Pannek, look at Bolton's botched PGA process, and award damages to the plaintiffs. Because both outcomes are logically possible based on the evidence, the judge cannot throw the case out. It must proceed to a full trial.
It's a brilliant illustration of how the legal system processes the messy reality of human contradiction. But it is vital to point out that the Sixth Circuit was not unanimous in this decision. There was a dissenting opinion authored by Judge Batchelder.
Yes, a very strong dissent.
And her dissent is fascinating because she looks at the exact same timeline we just discussed, but she views it through a highly technical, very rigid legal lens and concludes that the retaliation claim should have been thrown out of court immediately.
Judge Batchelder's dissent zeroes in on a highly specific, highly technical reading of the law regarding what actually constitutes a protected activity under federal law. If we recall step 1 of the McDonnell Douglas framework, the very first thing the employee must prove is that they engaged in an activity protected by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act.
And Title VII is the federal law that protects employees from discrimination based on specific protected classes, right? Things like race, sex, religion, national origin.
Yes.
It does not exist to protect you from a boss who is just a generic jerk. If your boss yells at you or is mean or forces you to bet on spreadsheet calculations, that is terrible management, but it isn't a federal civil rights violation.
That distinction is the bedrock of her argument. Judge Batchelder looks at the sequence of events and says, let's pause the timeline on April 2. On the exact day Bolton wrote that smoking gun email deciding to fire them, what information did U.S. Bank's management actually possess? Pannek made his hotline call on March 27. The official report generated by the hotline operator focused almost entirely on the betting incident, the clucking, and the general humiliation of the gift card. Crucially, the initial hotline report did not mention anything about sexual harassment or sex-based discrimination.
But wait, I want to push back on this. Pannek explicitly used the phrase hostile work environment in that initial March 27 complaint. Doesn't invoking that specific legal phrase automatically trigger Title VII protection?
That is the exact debate. The dissent forcefully argues that hostile work environment is not a magic legal talisman. You cannot simply wave that phrase around like a wand to instantly invoke the immense power of federal civil rights protection. The context of the complaint matters immensely. Using the phrase hostile work environment to complain about being coerced into a $150 bet doesn't magically transform a routine grievance about bullying into a protected Title VII complaint about sex-based harassment.
If I can try an analogy here to see if I understand the mechanics of her argument, it's kind of like calling the fire department because your cat is stuck in a tall tree.
Okay, I'm listening.
You yell emergency into the phone, but the fire department only has jurisdiction to respond to actual fires. Based on that first call, the dispatcher decides not to send the truck. 2 weeks later, you call back and clarify that the tree is actually engulfed in flames. Batchelder is saying you can't blame the dispatcher for the initial refusal because based on the information they had during the first call, it wasn't a fire.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanical logic of her dissent. Batchelder argues that U.S. Bank didn't officially become aware of the sexual nature of the harassment until Pannek and Stratman finally disclosed it during their interviews with HR on April 16 and 17.
Right, the timeline.
But Bolton had already made his definitive, documented decision to terminate them 2 weeks earlier, on April 2. Therefore, she argues, it's logically and chronologically impossible for Bolton's April 2 termination decision to be in retaliation for a sexual harassment complaint that he couldn't possibly have known existed until 2 weeks later. She sees zero causal link.
It is a devastatingly logical argument. It completely severs the timeline and cuts the legs right out from under the plaintiff's case. So if Judge Batchelder's logic is that precise, why did the majority of the appellate court ignore it and force the bank to face a jury trial anyway?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture of how high-stakes corporate litigation actually functions in the real world, this outcome provides a staggering lesson in procedural strategy. The majority of the court ignored this incredibly potent timeline argument because U.S. Bank's defense attorneys simply forgot to bring it up.
I'm sorry, what? The highly paid attorneys for a massive financial institution just forgot the argument.
Yes. The majority opinion explicitly notes in the ruling that U.S. Bank completely failed to argue before the lower district court, or in their primary appellate briefings, that Pannek and Stratman had failed to establish they engaged in a protected activity prior to April 2.
What?
The bank's lawyers focused their entire defense strategy solely on the causation element, arguing about the synergy exercise and the PGA, and ignored the timeline of the protected activity itself. In the federal appellate system, there is a strict rule known as the waiver doctrine. If you do not raise a specific legal argument at the appropriate time in the lower courts, you forfeit the right to use it later.
That's a brutal rule.
The appellate court acts purely as a neutral referee of the arguments the parties actually choose to present. It is not the court's job to invent a winning defense for a multi-billion-dollar corporation if the corporation's own legal team fails to articulate it.
That is absolutely staggering. A multi-million-dollar jury trial with all the associated media exposure and corporate risk is going to proceed largely because a defense attorney missed a highly technical timeline argument early in the chess match. That is the harsh reality of the adversarial justice system right there. Okay, so because of that, Pannek and Stratman successfully keep their retaliation claim alive for a jury. But we need to look at their other major claim because they didn't win everything.
Right.
They also sued U.S. Bank for directly subjecting them to a hostile work environment based on Gemrick's sexual overshares. And the appellate court completely threw that claim out. The bank won a total victory on that front. Why?
To understand why the bank won on this claim, we have to dive into a foundational cornerstone of employment law known as the Faragher-Ellerth affirmative defense. This legal standard stems from two landmark Supreme Court cases decided in the late 1990s. The Supreme Court was trying to balance two very competing, very difficult realities of modern commerce.
Which are?
On one hand, employers absolutely must be held accountable for toxic, discriminatory environments created by their management teams. On the other hand, a modern corporation is a massive, sprawling entity, and the CEO or the central HR department cannot mathematically monitor the daily conversations of every single middle manager in every branch office across the country.
Right. If a rogue vice president is secretly sexually harassing a subordinate behind closed doors, and that subordinate never tells another living soul, how can the corporate entity possibly be expected to fix a problem it doesn't know exists?
Exactly. So the Supreme Court established a functional rule to balance those interests. The rule dictates that if a supervisor harasses an employee, and that harassment directly results in a tangible employment action, meaning the harasser uses their power to fire the victim, demote them, or cut their salary, the corporate entity is strictly liable.
No excuses.
There are no excuses. No defense is available. The company pays.
Yeah.
However, if the supervisor harasses the employee but does not take a tangible employment action against them, the company is granted a specific window to defend itself.
And that distinction is vital in this case, because Jemrick, the man doing the harassing and the clucking, wasn't the executive who fired them. Bolton, a completely different executive, fired them. Jemrick just created the miserable environment. Because the harassment itself didn't culminate directly in the firing by the harasser, U.S. Bank is allowed to invoke this Faragher-Ellerth defense. How does a company actually prove this defense in court?
It's a strict two-pronged test, and the employer bears the burden of proving both prongs simultaneously. Prong 1 focuses on the company's preventative infrastructure. The employer must prove that it exercised reasonable care to prevent and promptly correct any sexually harassing behavior.
And did they?
In this specific instance, the appellate court found that U.S. Bank executed Prong 1 flawlessly. They maintained a robust, highly visible, written sexual harassment policy. They provided their employees with multiple, accessible avenues to report misconduct, including an anonymous third-party ethics hotline. They required mandatory anti-harassment training, which Pannek attended.
And perhaps most importantly, when Pannek finally did trigger the system by calling the hotline, the bank didn't attempt to bury the complaint to protect a senior executive.
They didn't.
They deployed Lori Gray. She investigated it rapidly and thoroughly. She substantiated the allegations, and the bank punished Jemrick swiftly and effectively. They issued the written warning. They froze his upward mobility for 90 days. They threatened his financial bonus, and the harassment permanently ceased. The corporate machinery worked exactly as designed, so U.S. Bank easily wins Prong 1. What does Prong 2 require?
Prong 2 shifts the focus entirely onto the behavior of the employee who was harassed. The employer must prove that the plaintiff employee unreasonably failed to take advantage of any preventative or corrective opportunities provided by the employer, or failed to avoid harm otherwise. And this is exactly where Pannek and Stroutman's hostile work environment claim completely collapses.
Because of the massive delay in reporting?
Exactly. The timeline is fatal to their claim. Pannek testified under oath that Jemrick began subjecting them to these inappropriate graphic sexual comments in November 2017. Yet Pannek waited until March 27, 2018, 4 full months of ongoing harassment later, to finally alert the bank's HR department.
That's a long time to wait.
And even then, as we discussed with Judge Batchelder's dissent, his initial hotline call didn't even mention the sexual nature of the behavior. It took until mid-April for him to vaguely reference the Access Hollywood tapes. And Stroutman's behavior was even more detrimental to his legal claim. He never reported the behavior to anyone at any point, and when directly asked about it by an active HR investigator, he refused to provide the necessary details.
I want to pause on this because what does this mean for you, the listener, if you find yourself in this nightmare scenario? We spent the first half of this conversation exploring the very real, very paralyzing power dynamics of the corporate hierarchy.
Right, the fear of speaking up.
The intense fear of retaliation, the fear of destroying your career trajectory by reporting a powerful boss. It's a terrifying position. Yet, the law seems to say that even if you are psychologically paralyzed by that entirely valid fear, you still must report the abuse immediately with perfect clarity, or you entirely forfeit your legal right to hold the company accountable for the toxic environment. That feels incredibly harsh. It feels like the legal system is actively punishing the victim for exhibiting a completely normal, well-documented psychological reaction to workplace trauma and bullying.
That criticism is widely shared among employee advocates and labor scholars. It absolutely places an immense, often overwhelming administrative burden on a highly vulnerable individual to act with perfect procedural precision while under intense psychological stress.
It demands bravery when bravery is most dangerous.
Exactly. But the courts are attempting to enforce a functional, systemic balance. The primary objective of Title VII is not merely to financially compensate victims after their careers have been destroyed. The primary objective is to force companies to stop the harassment from happening in the first place.
Prevention.
The courts mandate that corporations build the infrastructure to create safe environments, but they pragmatically recognize that corporations are not omniscient. If employees choose to sit on their rights for months, allowing the abuse to flourish in the shadows without ever utilizing the reporting mechanisms the company provided, the employer cannot be held strictly liable for failing to fix a problem they were intentionally kept blind to. The Faragher-Ellerth defense fundamentally demands that employees actively participate in the process of keeping their own workplace clean.
It's a brutal, unyielding reality check. The takeaway is clear. Document everything and report it early, clearly, and formally, even if your hands are shaking while you dial the hotline.
It's the only way to protect yourself.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground, but before we wrap up, we need to address how Pannek attempted to use the very restructuring that cost him his job as a weapon against the bank in a totally different way. Pannek also filed a claim for age discrimination under the ADEA, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act.
This is a fascinating final layer to the litigation because it explores how the courts interpret the mechanics of modern corporate efficiency. Pannek, who was over 40 years old and protected by the ADEA, claimed he was fired specifically because of his age.
And what was his evidence?
His primary evidence for this claim was the fact that following his termination, Allison Roberts, a significantly younger employee, took over his daily operational duties.
Which, on the surface, sounds like a classic age discrimination case. They fired the older guy and gave his job to the younger person. Why did the court dismiss this claim so quickly?
Because the court looks very closely at a legal definition of what it actually means to be replaced during a corporate restructuring. The law recognizes a massive difference between firing someone and hiring a younger replacement versus firing someone and simply redistributing their work to survive a budget cut.
Right. The court analyzed the mechanics of the synergy exercise. They ruled that if a company terminates your employment and then takes your existing tasks and spreads them out among the remaining staff, that does not legally constitute being replaced. Allison Roberts did indeed take over the majority of Pannek's vendor risk duties, but she absorbed those duties in addition to her own already existing job responsibilities.
Right, she just took on more work.
And Bolton took the rest of Pannek's tasks and distributed them to other surviving employees outside of the immediate group.
This is standard operating procedure. Consolidating roles, forcing remaining employees to wear multiple hats, and spreading out necessary duties is the fundamental mechanical reality of a reduction in force, or a RIF. The courts view this as an act of corporate efficiency, not an inherent act of discrimination.
So what do you need to prove it?
The legal precedent is clear. If you are let go during a legitimate corporate restructuring, and your job is absorbed by existing staff rather than backfilled with a brand new younger hire, you cannot just point to the age of the person doing your old work. You are required to provide extra, direct, or compelling statistical evidence that your specific age was the motivating factor for your termination. Pannek simply did not possess that extra layer of evidence. He couldn't prove that Bolton singled him out for the layoff because of his age, so the ADEA claim was rightfully dismissed.
We have dissected a truly chaotic timeline today. We've gone from the raw humiliation of a clucking senior executive through the murky intentions of a corporate synergy exercise, dissected smoking gun emails, examined the objective failure of a peer group analysis, and navigated the intense, highly technical legal frameworks of McDonnell Douglas and Faragher-Ellerth that ultimately dictate who wins and who loses in the federal appellate system.
It's been a journey.
This case, Pampa U.S. Bank, is an absolute masterclass in the messy, unfiltered reality of corporate life. It is what happens when toxic management, poorly executed layoffs, and severely delayed HR complaints all violently collide into a spectacular, slow-motion legal train wreck.
It really serves as a vivid cautionary reminder for both employees and employers. Corporate policies, reporting mechanisms, and restructuring protocols often look flawless and purely objective when printed in the employee handbook. But in reality, those policies are executed by flawed, stressed human beings operating under intense pressure and conflicting motivations.
That is the perfect summary. As we close out today's conversation, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to ponder. Something that builds on everything we've explored today about the psychological realities of the modern workplace. Consider the intense chilling effect that corporate restructurings have on the integrity of HR complaints.
This is a real issue.
We saw it play out clearly with Bolton's synergy exercise. When a massive corporation announces a reorganization, institutional paranoia immediately sets in. If an employee senses that a layoff is imminent, does human nature make them more likely to invent or exaggerate a harassment complaint, utilizing it as an artificial insurance policy to legally shield themselves from the chopping block?
That's the fear.
Or, conversely, is the impending threat of a layoff the exact psychological catalyst that finally pushes a terrified, paralyzed employee to report genuine, long-standing abuse simply because they feel they finally have absolutely nothing left to lose? As an employee trying to navigate a toxic hierarchy, or as an employer trying to manage liability during a merger, how do you successfully discern the actual truth when the timeline of human behavior is this muddy?
It remains the ultimate puzzle of employment law. A puzzle where objective truth is incredibly elusive, and there are rarely any easy answers.
Thank you so much for joining us for this extensive conversation. Remember to always meticulously document everything in your own workplace. Trust your instincts when a dynamic feels wrong, and deeply understand the reporting policies your company has in place. Stay safe out there in the corporate jungle.
If you like the Employee Survival Guide, I'd really encourage you to leave a review. We try really hard to produce information to you that's informative, that's timely, that you can actually use and solve problems on your own and at your employment. So if you like to leave a review anywhere you listen to our podcast, please do so. And leave 5 stars, because anything less than 5 is really not as good, right? I'll keep it up. I'll keep the standards up. I'll keep the information flowing at you. If you'd like to send me an email and ask me a question, I'll actually review it and post it on there. You can send it to Carey at capclaw.com. That's capclaw.com.